everyone. My name is Neema with the Neema Group here at Marcus and Millichap. Neema Ahadian. This is Jeff Estrada, and this is our lovely client, Alan Bernstein. We just completed a impressive portfolio sale for multiple buildings that we sold together. So thank you for entrusting us. We wanted to share a little bit about Alan's background, his decision, and the process of selling 275 units at once. So would you please tell us a little bit about kind of yourself, your background, and how you got into real estate?
Sure. I moved out to California in the early 90s, in late 1993. I had graduated college in the 80s from Duke, and then lived in New York for a few years, where I, just to get around, had a bicycle that I rode everywhere, and that actually wound up becoming my introduction to urban gentrification. And so I moved out here in 93 when LA was not doing great, and there was very little that had gentrified. And I did not ride a bicycle around LA, but I would drive around LA, and I became familiar with Koreatown and Westlake and Pico Union, and these areas that struck me as having a lot of untapped charm and a lot of potential. And so in the very late 90s, 1999 to be specific, I bought my first building, a 40-unit bricker on Wilton Place. And then over the next few years, I put together a portfolio of what at one point was 9 buildings and about 360 units.
Wow. Okay, awesome. Before we go into the buildings, I'm curious about what made you pick the locations and buildings in more detail, but you had a background of being a commissioner and running a pension fund.
Yeah.
It'd be lovely to hear a little bit about that.
So I was a public policy major at Duke, and had actually not done a lot with that. After college, I had gone into banking and then had worked in entertainment for a period of time before I started moving into real estate. But I was living with the kids in West Hollywood when they were born, and I wound up getting put onto an advisory board by the city of West Hollywood, and discovered I was pretty good at being a public servant. I've never run for anything, I've never been elected, but I've been appointed to a lot of things. And I wound up being a planning commissioner for 5 years in West Hollywood, including 1 year chairing that. And then Xavier Oslovsky, and then later Sheila Kuehl, who were both Los Angeles county supervisors, put me on the pension fund. So I was a trustee for a total of 14 years of the Los Angeles County pension.
Wow, it's impressive.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you ever buy anything in West Hollywood?
I owned my home in West Hollywood. I never bought multifamily. Well, my home was a duplex, but nothing beyond that.
Got it. So you mentioned your first building was Wilton, which when we were marketing the properties as individually and as a portfolio, Wilton had a lot of interest.
Yeah.
What was it about Wilton that created more interest versus some of the others?
Really just, quite frankly, the location. You know, I think that one kind of stood out as an outlier compared to the other buildings. But people just really liked the way that the curb appealed, the way the building looked, the story behind it, and really the location of it.
And that was the first building you purchased?
It was, yes. Yeah.
And that kind of reminded you of New York, or?
It reminded me of New York. I thought it had a lot of charm. It is a combination of 25 studios and 15 one-bedrooms, so it was a nice unit mix. I thought the building had a lot of charm. By the way, I think that all of the buildings had a lot of charm, and I had greater optimism for Koreatown and even for Westlake when I was acquiring the buildings. I think if the city had allowed the real estate to develop a little bit more organically, there was really an opportunity, particularly for Westlake, which has MacArthur Park, which should be a gem. It should be a fantastic attribute. I don't think it did become that, but I saw it there as having the potential that I still think it has. I just don't think that in the 20 subsequent years, it really gentrified in the way that clearly Hancock Park did. And although Wilton isn't in Hancock Park, it's sort of Windsor Square adjacent.
Yeah.
What's unfortunate is just a few days ago, there was an article about Langer's potentially closing due to homelessness and the overall traffic that you see outside of the restaurant. It's really a staple of our city.
It's like, how could you blame them though? Like, unfortunately, we were running tours at one morning with a buyer, 8 a.m. on a Saturday, and you see the workers at Langer's just mopping the floor, cleaning the street, and right outside, it's like a war zone. 8 a.m. No one's been asleep, and they're just crawling out of MacArthur Park.
I don't think that neighborhood is even just Langer's. I think Langer's is fantastic, but there are small Guatemalan, Salvadoreño enterprises that really could be great. Good people, good products. I just think that it's a challenging neighborhood, and it needs gentrification and it needs new construction, and LA is not at the moment really embracing that.
When you bought Wilton, did you always self-manage? And can you describe a little bit how managing from the early 2000s changed as you got longer in your ownership?
I did self-manage from the beginning, and for the first 2 years, it was just one 40-unit building, which was not complicated. And then, as the building portfolio grew, I left my day job, or it became my day job, if you will, and I built a management company, and I became a broker. So I was doing third-party property management for others for a period of time as well.
Did you stop the third-party management?
I did not stop it until we sold the portfolio.
I know.
That was, but I had stepped back from it quite a bit. I was doing more third-party property management, and I like the business of property management. To answer your question about the evolution of property management over 25 years in Los Angeles, I want to be clear. The buildings were rent stabilized when I purchased them. There was already significant restriction. There was already, I believe, a SCEP program. There were other programs involved. It was clearly going to be a collaboration between public and private enterprise. And as somebody who has served in government as an appointed, I understood that, and I felt prepared for that. What surprised me over the 25 years that I did this is how increasingly adversarial the public sector became towards the private enterprise, how sort of gratuitously and arbitrarily the city and the county, and to some degree the state, would just make it to manage a building. The number of gotchas that kind of came into the equation over the time that I was doing it. So it was always going to be a challenging thing. Anyone who manages property in LA knows that it is harder to manage property in LA than if you're in Nashville or Oklahoma City or Indianapolis. But I don't think I was anticipating how much harder Los Angeles City property management would become over a quarter of a century.
One thing I noticed is many of our clients that do self-manage, it's challenging to keep up with all the legislation and the anti-landlord legislation really that's out there. As a small operator, to keep updated with all the detailed logistics of how to manage so you're abiding by the law is really tricky. And even management companies that are professional management companies have a challenge doing it. Well, one thing I noticed is that many of the owners were hopeful that things might get better, but today's 2025, I feel like ever since COVID and post-COVID, it's gotten significantly harder. Did you experience that, and maybe how so?
Absolutely. Anyone who's been doing this knows that it's been challenging, and in fairness, I also made a good return on it. It was work, but it was work that paid off. COVID changed everything. First of all, the city and the county sort of abandoned being good faith partners. And to me, it was always a mutual understanding that we were providing safe, secure housing for people at a very affordable rate and a very predictable rate of rent for them. But the flip side was that you were able to run your buildings, you were able to enforce the regulations. I think the hardest challenge, and you made reference to small vendors or operators having a hard time keeping up with policy, but even larger ones. But the bottom line is, it went from being keeping up with policy to the reality that even following the policy wasn't always enough, that there were so many, whether it was the inspection process or the eviction process, whether it was the absolute bad faith lockout process,
Sure.
You couldn't even commit to learning the policy, following the policy, and trusting that you could predict the outcome, because it became increasingly arbitrary when governmental entities would basically ignore what was in place and sort of they would self-declare an emergency. And again, I think there are probably bad faith operators in every business, but I think most landlords are basically good faith operators. But when you self-declare an emergency and it becomes sort of this arbitrary, if you state you're having an economic problem, you are considered to be having an economic problem. I don't know how any prudent, responsible vendor prepares for that or executes on it.
We saw it this year with the attempted correlation between the fires and a rent freeze, which a lot of landlords, it's hard to process the correlation between them. Why would there be another rent freeze due to fires that are in Altadena and the Palisades?
I would go even further. And again, I bought rent-stabilized buildings. I may have opinions about whether rent stabilization works, but I certainly was aware what I was buying. It was clear. But the idea that you're stopping rent increases while the same city is putting in massive minimum wage increases, and you can track for older people who are depending on fixed incomes that Social Security was going up by a significant amount. There was no correlation between the declared economic emergency and the reality that the city of Los Angeles was demanding that people be paid substantially more every year. There was just a complete disconnect in the public process.
I remember when we asked Alan, why are you considering selling? And I want to ask him a few questions about the turning point for him, but I remember he always said, it's just not fun anymore. And it really stood out, because I feel like early in our career, we had a lot of owners that would visit their properties, they would be friendly with their tenants, there'd be dialogue, you ask them about their families, the holidays came around, there might be an exchange of gifts. And I don't see that anymore.
No, there's a very, very well-funded, very lucrative tenant advocacy industry in the county of Los Angeles. And I want to be clear, I think that the average tenant maybe has less power than the average landlord. I can understand the idea of wanting in a general way to protect tenants, but this tenant advocacy this tenant advocacy institution, to my observation, largely serves to convince tenants that they are inherently being abused, that they are inherently being victimized. And rather than making it a more cooperative process where everyone follows the rules and treats each other respectfully and appropriately, it makes
it's trying to become a battle.
where it's a constant battle.
Yeah.
And
What used to be just a friendly dialogue.
Yeah.
Hey, I have an issue, can you help me? Sure, how's Tuesday?
well, and look, whoever's listening to this, I'm guessing they're operators too, or they work with operators. And the reality is that there have always been tenants who are challenging. The trick to the game is always to make your best tenants have a good experience, to make them feel rewarded for being good tenants. And it's just so hard to work that kind of a system in the current paradigm.
And the unfortunate thing, as what we got to go through the process and have the opportunity to meet who you chose to surround yourself with, your staff, admin, all really, really, really good people. And the way that you held these buildings were to such a high standard.
Yeah.
Better than
Yes, most buildings of that vintage.
a lot of yeah, exactly. A lot of buildings of that vintage that we walk and see and smell from a mile away. The way that you really operate and keep those buildings on a consistent basis, it's really unfortunate seeing that tenant advocacy institution penalize people like yourself.
And that was a lot of what motivated me to pick up the phone and call.
So, great segue to the turning point. At what point did you decide to sell? Because I remember you sold a couple properties, and then you decided to sell the portfolio at once. And what's interesting about your situation is you actually moved yourself out of California.
I did.
So not just the equity, but you physically moved.
Me. Yeah. I have 3 children who are all in college right now. They're close in age. They're all in college, and this business of real estate, being a dad, has been a great business. I'm happy to stay involved in that. But this business of real estate had stopped being fun. But I think this is probably relatable for other owners. I think to some degree, I thought of them as my children, the buildings. It feels like a long-term commitment. It feels like an investment. I thought about whether I'd be passing them on to my children someday. I think that to me, in my mind, they became part of the family. And so part of the challenge was that it stopped being fun. And I thought more and more about why am I doing this? And I also thought I'm getting older, and maybe this is a younger man's game, a younger woman's game. And yet it was hard. It felt a bit initially like abandoning a child, which is why when I made the move, I sold one building to just sort of, because I wasn't sure that I wouldn't regret it. I wasn't sure that I wouldn't feel like I let go of my baby and I want it back. And I sold the building, and to my pleasant surprise, not surprise, but to my pleasant perception after it was done, I felt fine about selling it. And I sold another building about 6 months later, and then another building about 6 months later, at which point my youngest were getting ready to go off to college, and I was going to be an empty nester, and I wanted to transition to a different place and a different pace of life. And I realized I was ready to sell everything.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And you moved out of California. Can we talk about that briefly?
Sure.
About why and what led you there? And are you, I guess, happy moving out of an area?
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I want to say this. I have a lot of fondness for California. It's a beautiful state with interesting people and great weather, great food. I am not somebody who's angry at California. I got tired of California after 30 years, and I wanted a different pace. I got interested in farming. I bought myself a farm in Tennessee, and I made a commitment to get my daughters, who are twins, out of high school, and then to move to Tennessee to run a farm and to sort of operate in what seems like a better business and tax climate. And that was all just, for me, part of a process of realizing that the California that I had moved to in 1993 doesn't seem to really exist anymore. And with respect to the voters and the politicians of California, it doesn't seem that there is a genuine will to fix what seem like some of the operational challenges, the fires, the crime, the fact that streetlights don't get fixed for months. I think that California or Los Angeles has a set of priorities that are kind of clear, and to me they're not the most practical, basic priorities. My buildings served working class people, certainly not upper middle class or wealthy, not destitute, just working class people. And I really liked working with working class people, providing housing, giving them hopefully decent, clean housing that gave them an opportunity to focus on their children, their friends, their careers, not on leaks and bad wiring. It doesn't feel like Los Angeles is focused on the working class. It feels like its priorities are elsewhere. And so it was actually, when the time came, sort of easy to make the call that I needed to step away, because I was looking to run an operation that doesn't seem to be how this city and county are currently run.
Got it. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. I will have, maybe Jeff, you can describe a little bit about how we got connected with Alan and the initial call, and also, well, really, we'll start there, and then I'll wanted to ask Alan a few questions about selecting a broker and what stood out in his decision-making process for that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really awkward time in LA. The fires were happening. It was the second day of the fires, and I actually connected with Jeff first.
Right.
And then from there, it's maybe about 6 p.m., just no one really in the office besides a few people, and I get a call ID, Alan Bernstein. Like, why is Alan calling me? I didn't call him today. And we talk, and it was really, I don't know if you remember this, but it was really, you were a little reluctant at first, the way I remember the conversation, but it was really more information that would be helpful for you. Mm-hmm. And really making it about what you needed, and that we weren't going to really sugarcoat anything. And whatever question you had, we'd answer. And we had a nice conversation. At the end, you said, "Do you want to meet me at this building tomorrow?" I'm like, sure. Let's throw on suits, and we show up, and get a call 2 hours later, and would you like to please continue reviewing the portfolio? So it seems like we made a good first impression. But that's a little bit of how we got connected initially with the portfolio.
Yeah, I had sold 3 buildings. I had 6 buildings left to sell. I had obvious complications in terms of how to navigate all that, because the buildings were owned by different entities. I'm a common thread through all the buildings, but I'm the only common thread, and I had a responsibility to serve each building and each group of investors appropriately. But at the same time, I had frankly, a strong personal desire to move towards wrapping it all up, and a sense that maybe the best way to move it was to move them all together. But from the beginning, it was clear that it was going to be a complicated dance, and that it was going to matter a lot to me who I picked, who I want to also be clear, who my investors, were certainly involved in the decision, but I got to be the lead person throughout all of it, and it was very important. And I had not had bad experiences selling the other buildings. We didn't work on those buildings together, but it was just a different scale. And again, it required respecting the subtleties of, we're trying to move a portfolio, but we have to make sure that we are not failing to serve each building, because then if that were happening, I couldn't make a good faith recommendation to one particular building. Hey, can you take a bad deal to help my other buildings out? So it was going to be really important who I worked with, and I suspect you have other questions that I can answer.
Well, thank you for that. And it was a very fun and challenging process that I'll discuss maybe in a few moments, but I really do see, especially on assignments like this, it becomes a partnership where us and the seller become one.
Yeah.
And if you remember in our first meeting, I always said that to you, that you and our team are going to become one.
Yeah.
We are going to be on one side of the equation, and the other, and it is us against the world. Not in a bad way, but in a way that we truly feel like we became a part of you. And when you said that you have a responsibility to all the investors, we take that into heart, because we have to make you look just as good as we have to make the properties look good.
Yeah.
So I guess one question is, in selecting a broker, how did you make that decision? Maybe what stood out in our process that would have helped you, and what else about that decision-making part of the process, which is really crucial because you're picking someone, and we had to, we didn't have a deadline, but we definitely had a change in your rate towards the end of the year
Right.
that we wanted to sell before it increased.
Right. I would say there were two primary considerations that drove the decision for me. One was the scale of selling 6 buildings, 275 units at once. And I just thought that Neema, your team, and Marcus and Millichap were able to handle that scale. There were competitors, if that's the term for other agents, who I thought could absolutely sell buildings individually. But again, I had sold 3 buildings individually. I could conceive of selling 6 more, but I have to say it took the better part of 15 months to sell 3 buildings. I didn't want to be spending the next 5 years selling my buildings. And so scale and ability to handle scale was one factor, but probably to me an even slightly bigger factor, it is the nature of brokers to engage in puffery. And I'm a broker. I understand that. I know that it's legal, but you talked about working together as a team. You talked about that now. You talked about it at the time. And I didn't have any doubt that my buildings were very good examples of what they are, but they are not perfect buildings. And it is certainly not a perfect selling market. And I didn't need puffery. I needed people who were communicating directly and honestly with me. I needed people who were not going to be rude and insulting, although I can't think of anyone else who was rude and insulting, but who were going to tell me what I needed to hear when I needed to hear it, because you talked about it sort of working as a team. I thought of it as maybe more of a dance where it was 2 parties and you each needed to know your steps and to be able to execute them together. And if I didn't trust my broker to being candid with me, I didn't think that I could do my part of the choreography nearly as effectively.
That's beautiful. Yeah, to think about it as a dance, and really there were so many times where we would rely on each other, either me on Jeff, or even though I was maybe the central point of communication when it came to critical deal points and decision-making parts of the process, but the process that everyone took together during tours, marketing, handling objections, and there was, look, we had, if I may say, there was litigations that we had to deal with, lost runs, we had delinquencies ranging anywhere from 10 to, we won't say the higher range, but delinquencies were a part
We
of
had
the
delinquencies.
We had delinquencies.
Yeah.
And there's also understanding the real estate. And we spent a lot of time at the buildings before coming to market, even without bothering Alan, understanding it so that when we get asked the questions from different investors, and we had put together a summary of offers, we wanted to illustrate to you and your partners, if you sold them individually, here are your options. And if we sold them collectively, here's what it looks like. And here's the buying habits and the buying profiles of these buyers. Here's the background of them. And there is so much involved in that. We don't really think of it because it's kind of, it's what we do.
I know.
But now that you mention it's like a dance, there is a lot. And there were times where I might have been leading, and there's times where you were leading, and there's times where Jeff was leading, and you just kind of go until the song stops. So as our process continued, we had multiple offers from different buying entities, some in 1031 exchanges, some looking for individual properties for specific reasons. It might have been within walking distance of another property, an emotional attachment to a location, whatever it might be. And of course, we had a handful of investors that were looking to purchase it as a portfolio, which matched Alan's goals. If you don't mind, please explain a little bit about how we decided together to pick the buyer that we ended up choosing, and maybe that one call that I'll always remember of, Neema, you're going left, and I said, Alan, I'll go whichever way you want me to go, but I think going right might be better for us.
Yeah. I mean, clearly picking the buyer, and let me say, as a credit to the team, the fact that I got to pick the buyer was, of course, in and of itself, an asset to working with your team, that there were options, but there were options, and there were people who were interested in individual properties. There were people who were interested in the portfolio. Two of the buildings had habitability claims that I would describe as nuisance complaints in the sense that there was no open city or governmental inspection, but these things exist and they create challenges, and it affected how some buyers looked at the portfolio and others didn't, and it was not clear to me which way to go, and I feel that it was one of those times where what I had asked at the very beginning was that you not tell me what I want to hear, but tell me what I need to hear. And up until that point, this point of having to make a decision what buyer to go with, you and the team had been really good about that, about telling me what I needed to hear. And it was really important because ultimately you were recommending going with a portfolio buyer who you recommended as being reliable and solid. And this is candidly a buyer's market in Los Angeles. And at some point that will no doubt change, but it does not appear to be changing anytime soon. And it makes it incredibly important to try to work with a buyer who's going to be reliable, because buyers have a leverage to sort of keep on making asks, and to some degree, once you're on a path with them, it's hard to navigate all of that. And I was prepared to sort of write off the two buildings that had what, again, I thought were nuisance habitability claims, but they impacted how buyers looked at the building. And you proposed looking at the buyer who I wound up selecting as being somebody who was diligent, tough, but fair and honorable. And that was ultimately a time where I wasn't in the moment sure that I agreed with you. I certainly knew that I had the power to make the decision.
Sure.
But I also had to reflect on the faith that I wanted to put in the team, and that you had kept your word to me, which was to not overhype things, not oversell things, to present them in a sober and reasonable fashion.
Yeah.
And I was therefore, when we had what was frankly a tough conversation, able to listen fairly unemotionally to what you were saying and to hear the logic of the approach. And I want to say, while one can never quite know exactly what another path that you don't go down is going to be like, I have very little doubt sitting here a few months later that it was a very smart choice and that it worked out very well, and that it is how I was able to accomplish the thing that I really wanted to accomplish, which was to sell the portfolio, to not be dealing with this all the way through my kids' graduations from college and grad school, hopefully, but to be done and to be able to move on to the next chapter of my life and my investors' lives.
I never explained to you, but the other part of the equation that we do on the back end is when we have these deep discussions about what your goals are, and these important deadlines that are interest rate adjustments or maturity dates, or even personal, we didn't have it here, but some people have personal timeframes that they have to abide by. Moving out of the country, they have something in the family. So on the back end, I would take notes and listen and see what is our seller's goals, and I would write them out. And going down this path, how does that help us? And really breaking up the portfolio or selecting a portion of them to one buyer and leaving the two with claims would have put us in a position that we would have been weak later. And there were countless hours where we sit in our office and we list out what are the pros and cons, what are our seller's goals, how does this buyer perform? Let me call his lender, which we did. Let me call 2 escrow officers. Let me get their background. Let's look at their schedule of real estate. How does it compare to these? When they walked the building, what questions were they asking?
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time together as the team trying to help navigate a path that would work well, but ultimately it is your decision. And I feel like we made the right one. Awesome. Well, a point of reflection.
Yes.
I have a few questions. I'll lay them out, and maybe you can answer whichever you feel comfortable.
Okay.
What are you doing with the proceeds?
Okay.
What would you have done differently?
Okay.
How do you feel now after selling 275 units in core LA? And what advice would you maybe offer other clients or owners that are in the same position that you were 9 to 12 months ago?
Sure. Listen, I can't presume how other owners think and feel, but if there's something relatable for somebody who's watching this about me, I can just share my own experience. And it was a tough decision to sell. It was an emotional decision to sell. I said at other points, I thought of the buildings in some ways as my children. I had a bit of an epiphany that I actually have 3 children that I love as I imagine any parent loves their child, and that I don't have. I treated my responsibility as a property owner and a property manager with love and consideration and care. But at the end, I had to realize I didn't love the buildings and that it was okay for them to go somewhere else. And maybe that's a little too Californian for other people,
Sure.
But that's how I looked at it. And it's only, I'm doing 1031 exchanges. I'm still within my 45-day identification period. It's very new. I will say to manage property the way that we manage property required a lot of time and energy, and I feel still almost a sense of withdrawal from, frankly, the stress of a quarter of a century of managing property in the county of Los Angeles. And I look forward to getting past some of that. When I read the news in LA, and if anyone who reads the news in LA knows that every week there's some attack being proposed at the city or county or state level on private ownership rights. And I am still having this shock of recognizing, oh, that's not affecting me anymore. I don't own the buildings. Neema and his team found somebody who wanted that responsibility. I wish them the best. I still think that real estate is a very good investment. I just am very grateful to be moving my money out of California into places where, especially for somebody at my age, somebody who's an empty nester, somebody who wants to be focused a little bit more on other things, I don't quite feel as much of a sense of being in combat with the local governing entities.
And you mentioned you're looking at Nashville for multifamily and surrounding areas and potentially DSTs.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at both, and I will likely do DSTs, which is very much a personal choice. A quarter of anyone who's managed property for a quarter of a century, I think, could understand the desire to take a breather from being in active management. Certainly, there are other markets that, for someone who wanted to do active management, are frankly more appealing. I will say, in 1999, when I started the property management company, I really enjoyed the interaction with the tenants. And I would flatter myself that I'm good at managing properties. I think Los Angeles is so combative with property owners that it's almost impossible over the long haul to feel good about it. I could easily imagine feeling good about property management in a more balanced, a more reasonable market. But the one thing that I will say, I haven't made my final decisions. The money will be out of California.
Got it. Any parting words before? Thank you very much for spending time with us.
Thank you for pulling me in. It's great to have an excuse to see you guys. I got up in a plug for Patty, who we didn't talk about, who is just fantastic and the glue on the whole Neema team, in my opinion.
Yes. And we could talk about that because in a transaction that has so many moving parts and 275 leases and gathering the information, it's having a core team member that's dedicated to helping the process move along. Is very valuable when we need to create comfort for a buyer to get over the mental hump of, okay, let's move forward and do a deal. It's a collective approach.
Yeah.
And if I were to just say, it is what it is, I hope you figure it out, we would have never gotten anywhere.
I feel like we focused on the sales part. There obviously are a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of detail involved in all of this.
Thank you guys for listening. This was really an engaging process for us to be assigned and work with Alan, and we're really grateful for you entrusting us. I wanted to ask you, is there anything you wanted to end with, or some final thoughts that we can listen in on?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I had a good run in California, and like any relationship that is sort of great and then begins to sort of wither and unravel, there absolutely was this feeling of, I wish I could get back to when it was more fun, and I seemed to be dealing with fewer complaints and making money a little bit more easily. And you guys came along, and you were great at sort of understanding both the business and the human element of this, because there's no question that it was the smart, correct business decision for me and for my partners. And at the same time, it was letting go of a quarter of a century of a pretty intense experience of something that I did while my family was growing up. There was a human element to it, and not all of that was easy, even when it was logical. And so I think what I would just commend your team for is helping me walk through both a business and a fairly intensely personal decision, because property management turns out to be a fairly intense personal experience as well as a business experience. And I don't think I could have navigated it, and we as investors could have navigated as well, with a team that didn't sort of understand that it was both logical and emotional to go through.
Sure. That's wonderful. Well, thank you for that. We really do appreciate it, and we don't take it lightly. I do take the word listing as a fiduciary, and we take the word fiduciary as a strong meaning. It reminds me of, I'll end with what one of our previous mentors taught me, that we're in the business of relationships. We just happen to sell real estate. And that kind of made me remind me of that, where the relationship between you and us, the relationship between you and the buildings, the relationship with you and your investors and partners, the relationship with the tenants, the relationship with all the buyers that we got in the car and drove around for God knows how many days. So it really is, and thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for that, Alan. Okay.